Hey guys, thanks for joining me today. I want to do something really fun today, and that is go over some beginner photography tips and getting your exposure correct in the camera. So if you've had a DSLR like this one for a while and you find that you're just shooting on that little automatic setting and you want to start evolving and you want to start learning a little bit more about how to use your settings correctly, this is going to be really helpful for all you beginners. So there are basically three major things that contribute to how well your image is exposed, and those things are what we call the exposure triangle. So we're going to go through all three of these things one by one. All right, so we're going to talk about the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, and how they all impact the exposure of your image and how they all work together to create a really great image. So the first thing we're going to talk about is aperture. You'll also see this listed as f-stop. So on your camera you will see F and then a number. So essentially this controls how much light is allowed into the camera. If the number that comes after the letter F is very, very small, like 1.8, 2.8, that means that that's going to be letting lots and lots of light into your camera. If that number is really high, like F11, F16, F22, that means it's going to be letting only a little tiny bit of light into your camera. So the aperture also controls how blurry your background is. So if you really like that depth of field where you have a sharp subject and a nice blurry background, that's also going to be something that the aperture is in control of. So if you want a lot of your image in focus, you're going to want a higher aperture. If you want a small amount of your photo in focus, you're going to want a lower aperture. Now, the aperture is actually controlled by your lens and not by your camera. Each lens will have its own minimum aperture. If you're looking at prime lenses, those tend to be a lot smaller than zoom lenses. So take a look at your lens and see what kind of aperture you're working with. And the second thing we're going to talk about is shutter speed. So essentially the shutter opens and then closes on your image. And for the amount of time that it's open, it's capturing data in that image. And as soon as you close it, you stop capturing data. So if you have a lot of fast moving subjects and you want to freeze them in motion and you don't want them to be blurry, you're going to have to increase your shutter speed because you want it to open and close very fast in order to freeze that subject. If, for example, you want to capture some blur in your image, let's say you're taking a photograph of some cars moving and you really want it to feel like they're moving in the image, you can actually leave that shutter open a little bit longer and close. The entire time that car is moving, it'll be capturing that data and you'll see a blur in your image. So if your subject isn't moving, you have a lot of flexibility in keeping your shutter speed open for a longer period of time in order to capture all that data. This can be especially important at night. So if you're trying to take a picture of a moving subject at night, it might be a bit more difficult because if you open the shutter speed to spend more time capturing that light and exposing your image properly, anything that's moving is going to be blurry. But if, let's say, you're trying to photograph architecture at night and you have a tripod, you can leave your shutter open for a long period of time without any blur happening at all. So the faster your shutter speed, the darker your image is going to be. The slower your shutter speed, the lighter your image is going to be. But remember, that comes with the added blur that happens when you lower your shutter speed. If you want to keep your shutter speed open and you don't mind getting a lot of blur, you can go to 1/60 or even lower than that if you'd like. If you're trying to freeze motion, you might need to go to 1/500 or even higher than that, depending on how fast your subjects are moving. And the third thing that we're going to talk about is ISO. So ISO is essentially how sensitive your camera is to light and capturing that data. So you would want to base your ISO depending on the amount of light you have available to you. So if you have a lot of light available to you, say you're outdoors on a sunny day, you don't need the camera to be super sensitive to that light because there's plenty of it available. You can go down to 100 or 200 depending on your situation. If you're indoors in a relatively dimly lit environment, you need that camera to be more sensitive to the light in order to capture enough light and enough data to properly expose your image. So if you're in a dimly lit situation, you might need to go up to 1,000 or more. Now, one thing to remember when it comes to ISO is the higher that number, the more noise or grain or static will show up in your image. So if you have a very high ISO, 2000 plus, you might get a really grainy image. But if you have a very low ISO, like 100, you should get a nice clear image. Now, when it comes to static in your images or grain, it's really a preference. Some people don't mind it, some people hate it, some people don't mind a little. So it's totally up to you kind of what you're going for and what you're looking for. It also depends a bit on which camera you're using. So some cameras do better with their ISO settings and some of them don't do quite as well. As cameras are evolving, a lot of the newer cameras are doing really well with higher ISO images. So now, how does this all come together? Now we kind of understand what each of those three settings mean, what they are, but that is where the exposure triangle comes into play. You need to balance all three of these settings to get a nice, beautifully bright exposed image. And a lot of my settings are based on educated guesses, essentially, because of how long I've been photographing. I am starting to understand very well how all these settings work together. So I don't need to spend too much time working on it because I can do it very quickly in my head and testing it out. But if you're just a beginner, it might take a little bit longer to fiddle with the settings and figure out how they all work together. So the first thing that I'll do when I'm in an environment is I will figure out how much light is available to me. And then I will figure out what I want my aperture to be ideally, and then I will figure out my shutter speed. So that's the order that I like to use, and then I always go back and finesse a little bit as I start playing around and seeing what happens. So if I'm outdoors like I am now and it's super bright, first thing I'm gonna do is change my ISO and make it as low as I possibly can, likely around 100. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna decide what my aperture is gonna be. So if I don't mind seeing this fence behind me, I can heighten it a bit. If I wanna blur it out as much as possible, then I'll wanna go as low as possible. But that will also affect my shutter speed. So that's the last thing that I tend to adjust. It's just my shutter speed based on what I want it to look like in terms of my depth of field and how much light I have available to me. So I would do low ISO in this situation. Depending on what I want to do for the background, that's how I'd set my aperture. And then my shutter speed would be based on those two other things, and likely pretty high because it's really bright right now. If I'm indoors in an environment like this one, my little basement workspace, I don't have as much light available. So first thing I would do is I would bring my ISO a little bit higher, so maybe 400, 800, even 1,000, and then I would decide what aperture I wanted. In low light, it's nice to have a lower aperture, so I might pick a prime lens and do a 1.8. That'll give me a nice depth of field, which personally I love, and then it'll also help me capture as much light as possible. And then I can fiddle with my shutter speed to figure out how fast or slow I want that to be. And then I'll go from there. And that's it. I hope you've found some really valuable information, and I hope that if you've been shooting on auto for a long time, that you start playing with those settings and start taking some control back from your camera and taking some great images. If you found something in this video valuable, please give it a thumbs up. Let me know down in the comments if there's anything else that you want to learn about photography, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel, turn on the bell so you get notified every single time I post a new video, and I hope to see you around soon.